Some stories are told with a smile, others with a tear, but the most powerful ones are told in silence, when everything has been lost and all that remains is the courage to rise again. Hi, I'm Lily Blake, and if you're watching this, you probably have some idea of how life can throw curveballs at you when you least expect it. But my story isn't about me. It's about my dad, Aaron Blake. You see, he's the reason I'm here, sharing this story with you. Not because of what happened to him, but because of how he handled it. We live in Crystal Haven, a fast-paced city that practically breathes innovation. The skyline is dotted with glass towers, each one home to companies that are changing the world in some way. Among them is Lumitech Innovations, the company my dad worked at for over 15 years. My dad wasn't the CEO, and he wasn't the one running the biggest projects, but he was the backbone of the company. Everyone who worked with him knew that. He was the kind of guy who could turn any problem into a solution just by working his ass off. His co-workers respected him, and the clients loved him. But the one person who seemed to never appreciate him was Adrian Steele. Adrian had only been with Lumitech for a couple of years, but when the last sales manager left, he was the one who got promoted. It wasn't a surprise. Adrian was all about appearances. He played the part, dressed in expensive suits, talked a big game, and wasn't shy about flexing his ambition. The thing was, he didn't know the first thing about the people who made the company great, and that included my dad, Aaron Blake. I remember when Adrian first joined. Everyone warned my dad about him. "He's got his eye on your job, Aaron," they said. But my dad, he just shrugged it off. He didn't worry about things he couldn't control. Still, there was something about Adrian that rubbed my dad the wrong way. Maybe it was his arrogance, or the way he treated people like they were tools for his own advancement. Whatever it was, it created a tension that only got worse as the months went by. Dad didn't let it show, at least not to us. To me, he was still the same quiet, determined guy who spent late nights working on his projects, always focused on getting things done the right way. And for me, that was enough. I admired him so much, even though I never really told him that. The thing is, my dad was always on the edge of something big. He'd been working for months on this one deal, a $700 million contract with a European energy company. It was his biggest opportunity yet, the one he'd been working for since I could remember. If this deal went through, it would change everything. It would secure his place at Lumitech, and who knows, maybe even set him up for a higher role. But there was a problem. Adrian Steele. Now, before you get any further, I want you to do me a favor. If you've ever felt like life was about to knock you down, or if you've ever had someone make you feel small when you knew you deserved more, then I want you to stick with me and watch this whole story. I promise, you'll want to see how this one ends. So hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let's dive into what happened next. It was one of those mornings when you just knew something wasn't right. My dad was already up and gone by the time I woke up, his laptop and papers scattered on the kitchen table like usual. It was only when I checked my phone that I saw the text. "I'll be late. Big meeting today. Don't wait up." I knew that meant he was on edge, but he never said it. He didn't have to. I could tell by the way he was acting lately, distant, tired, like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. At that point, I didn't know how much of the weight was coming from Adrian Steele. It wasn't until later that day that I started to see the cracks in the plan my dad had spent months perfecting. I had a feeling things were about to go wrong the moment Adrian decided to call an emergency meeting in the middle of the presentation preparations. Adrian was an expert at making people feel insignificant. The first time I saw him in action was a few months ago when he was in the break room with a few of the senior executives. He'd been talking about optimizing the team, and when my dad walked in, Adrian didn't even acknowledge him. It was one of those moments where you could feel the cold air in the room shift, and I could see my dad clench his jaw but say nothing. But today, Adrian was about to take it further than he ever had before. I'll leave you hanging for now, but trust me, this is only the beginning. You won't believe what happens next, so make sure to stay with me and watch till the end. This story has so much more in store. Hit the like button and subscribe if you don't want to miss the shocking twists that will change everything. The days leading up to the big deal were intense. I could see it in the way my dad stayed up late, his fingers typing away at his laptop while he reviewed endless documents. His eyes were always tired, but there was a fire in him I hadn't seen before. He was laser-focused. This deal wasn't just another contract. It was his shot at something bigger, something that could change the course of his career. And I could tell that it wasn't just about the money. It was about proving to himself that all those years of hard work meant something. One evening, just after dinner, I found my dad sitting at the kitchen table, his forehead creased with worry as he stared at his phone. I walked over, hoping to break the tension with some small talk, but I could tell something was off. He'd just received a message from one of his colleagues, Adam, an older guy who had been working with him for years. "Everything okay, Dad?" I asked, taking a seat next to him. He sighed, putting his phone down for a moment. "It's just that Adrian is making things harder than they need to be." "Adrian?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. I knew who Adrian was, but I hadn't realized his actions were affecting Dad like this. "Yeah," Dad continued. "He's been taking credit for my ideas, shutting me out of meetings and, well, I'm not the only one noticing." He rubbed his eyes. "But I'm not going to let it distract me. Not now. I've worked too hard for this." I wanted to say something comforting, but I wasn't sure what. I knew Dad would never back down, no matter how much Adrian pushed him aside. It was just the kind of person he was. But deep down, I could feel this growing tension in my stomach. I wasn't sure if it was just the pressure of the deal, or something more. Something I wasn't seeing yet. The next few days were a blur. Dad was always gone by the time I woke up, and I didn't get to see much of him, except when he came home late at night, still buried in work. I could hear him on the phone with clients, his voice steady but sharp, as he talked through the details of the deal. The pressure was on, and I could feel it in every corner of our house. Then came the morning of the presentation. Dad had been preparing for weeks, going over every detail, rehearsing his pitch until it was flawless. And then, just hours before the meeting, I saw something that sent a chill down my spine. Adrian had pulled a fast one. I was in my room when I overheard Dad's conversation with his colleague Adam. His voice was tense, and I could barely make out the words. "He's putting Olivia in charge?" Dad asked, disbelief in his voice. "She's barely had any experience with this kind of deal." I didn't need to hear the rest. It was clear what Adrian was doing. He was sidelining my dad, putting someone less qualified in charge of a deal that my dad had spent months working on. And why? Because he could. Because it made him feel powerful. I stayed quiet, not wanting to interrupt, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Adrian had taken a job that was my dad's, his pride, and handed it to someone who couldn't possibly understand the scope of it. And my dad, he wasn't angry, not really, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes. Later that night, when he came home, I saw that same look on his face. He was quiet, not angry, not upset, just quiet. And that silence, that calmness, was more unsettling than any outburst could have been. "I'll do what I have to do," he said to me. not looking up from the stack of papers in front of him. "But if it all goes south, I'm ready." I didn't know what he meant by that, but I didn't press him for answers. I just let him get to work, his fingers moving across the keyboard at a steady pace. I didn't understand it then, but I was beginning to realize something. My dad wasn't just going to let this slide. He had a plan, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was coming next was going to be huge. That was the night I first started to understand that Dad wasn't just focused on the deal. He was preparing for something else, something I couldn't see yet. But I was going to find out soon enough. The day of the pitch arrived, and everything that my dad had worked for, the late nights, the countless revisions, the hours of practice, was about to come to a head. I could feel the nerves in the air as I sat at my desk at home, waiting for his call. He'd promised me he'd update me afterward, but something in the back of my mind told me that today wasn't going to go the way we'd hoped. I hadn't heard from him by midday, so I decided to grab a coffee and wait. Then, just as I was sipping the last of it, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my dad, just 3 words: "Not good. Stay calm." That was all it took to send my heart racing. Something had gone wrong. I immediately turned on the newsfeed for Lumitex's company updates, knowing I'd probably see something soon. Minutes later, a live feed started playing. It wasn't from a big news outlet or anything, just one of those internal company broadcasts. But what I saw sent a chill through my entire body. There he was, my dad, standing in front of the European clients, trying to explain the proposal he had worked on for months. He was confident, as always, but there was an undeniable tension in the room. And then Adrian stepped in. I couldn't hear every word, but I could see the look on Adrian's face. It wasn't the usual cold professionalism. This was different. Adrian stood up, raised his voice, and started accusing my dad of errors in his presentation. Not just minor mistakes either. Adrian was questioning his entire approach, calling his methods outdated and his calculations incorrect. I felt like the ground beneath me shifted. My dad was standing there, in front of the clients, being publicly torn down. It was all happening so fast, and I could barely comprehend what was going on. My dad, always so calm, was being humiliated in front of everyone. And then it happened. Adrian, with a cold smile, walked over to my dad's laptop. With a swift motion, he slammed it down on the desk, shattering it in front of the clients. The noise of the impact echoed through my phone, and I swear, my heart stopped for a moment. That was it. My dad's entire presentation, all the files, all the data he had worked so hard to prepare, gone in an instant. I could hear the murmurs from the room, the confusion and disbelief, but none of it reached me like the devastation in my dad's eyes. He didn't react. Not in the way I expected. He didn't yell. He didn't get defensive. Instead, he turned and walked out of the room, his back straight, his steps measured. It was as if he was walking away from everything he had built, all for something bigger I couldn't yet understand. In that moment, I felt a mix of anger, confusion, and a deep sense of helplessness. This wasn't just a corporate move, this was personal. Adrian had made sure that my dad's failure was public. He'd torn down my dad's years of hard work in front of the people who mattered most. And yet, my dad didn't fight back. He just left. I couldn't wrap my head around it. I wanted to call him right then, demand to know why he wasn't saying anything, why he was taking this without fighting back. But I didn't. I knew he'd call me when he was ready. The rest of the day passed in a blur. The usual updates from the company were replaced with vague statements about the presentation and internal adjustments. No one mentioned my dad. No one said a word about the laptop being destroyed or the tension that had spilled into the room. That night, when my dad finally came home, he was different. His face was pale, his eyes tired. But there was something else there too. Something I couldn't quite place. As soon as he walked through the door, I saw it. Despite everything that had happened, despite Adrian's attempt to ruin him, my dad was calm, unshaken. It was like the world could be crashing down and he would still stand tall. "You okay?" I asked, hesitant to break the silence. He nodded, sitting down slowly. "Yeah, just tired. I'll explain later." I wanted to press him, to ask him everything, but I could see the weight of the day on him. It was more than just the deal. It was something deeper. And even though I didn't fully understand it, I could feel that he wasn't going to let Adrian get the best of him. That night, after dinner, he sat down next to me on the couch, his hands still resting lightly on his knees. His voice was soft, but I could hear the certainty behind every word. "It's not over, Lily," he said quietly, his eyes meeting mine. "Trust me, there's more to this than what you saw." And just like that, I knew. This wasn't the end. My dad wasn't the type to let something like this slide, not when there was so much at stake. But what he was planning, I had no idea. All I knew was that I had to be patient. Whatever was coming next, it was going to be big. I didn't fully understand what was going through my dad's mind in that moment. But I was starting to see something I hadn't before. His quiet strength wasn't just about taking punches and moving on. It was about something bigger. And if I could just be patient, maybe, just maybe, I'd get to see how he was going to turn this all around. The days that followed were a blur of tension. The office seemed like a pressure cooker, with every conversation wrapped in a layer of uncertainty. I could feel it, even when I was just walking through the halls of the building. Something wasn't right. The tension that had already been building between my dad and Adrian was now spilling over into every corner of the company. What I didn't know at the time was that the deal was already beginning to fall apart. Adrian had made his move, sidelining my dad and giving the presentation to Olivia, but it didn't take long for the cracks to show. Olivia, despite her bright smile and good intentions, simply wasn't prepared for the scale of the deal. She didn't have the same depth of knowledge or the client relationships that my dad had spent years building. And the clients, they weren't impressed. They had seen Aaron Blake's work firsthand. They knew the depth of his expertise. Olivia's lack of experience was obvious to them from the start. They tried to push through, but it was clear that the presentation wasn't going well. I couldn't imagine how Dad must have felt when the news started trickling in. The clients were pulling back. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation between my dad and one of his colleagues, Adam. I was sitting in the kitchen, working on some homework, when I caught a few words that froze me in place. "This is it, Adam. They're pulling out," Dad said, his voice low but firm. I knew Adrian would mess this up, but I didn't think it would happen so fast. I felt a rush of fear flood through me. I couldn't hear the rest of the conversation, but it was clear that something was going terribly wrong. The clients weren't just hesitating, they were starting to pull back from the deal entirely. And to make matters worse, Adrian refused to bring my dad back in, even when the clients demanded a meeting with him. I felt helpless, sitting there on the other side of the door, knowing that there was nothing I could do. The situation was spiraling, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that Adrian was going to make sure my dad couldn't fix things. His refusal to let Dad step back in was the final blow. And it wasn't just the deal that was falling apart. The entire company was starting to question Adrian's leadership. Executives who had once followed him with blind faith were starting to see the cracks in his arrogance. Without the key relationships and the experience my dad had cultivated over the years, Adrian's polished surface was starting to fade. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my dad had been right all along. He had known this was coming. Later that night, Dad sat down on the couch beside me. He was quiet for a long time, staring off into the distance, lost in his thoughts. I could feel the weight of everything on him, but he wasn't showing it. He had always been good at hiding his emotions. "Dad, what's going on?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He turned to look at me, and for a moment, I saw something flicker in his eyes. It was a mix of frustration and determination, but it was also the calm before the storm. He leaned back, letting out a deep breath. "I knew this was going to happen," he said softly. "I knew the minute Adrian sidelined me that he wasn't ready. And now the clients are pulling back. It's all falling apart, and he won't let me fix it." I didn't know what to say. My dad, the guy who could fix anything, who had always had an answer for everything, was the one who needed help now. It felt like the world was closing in on him, and I didn't know how to make it better. "Is there anything we can do?" I asked, hoping for a way out of this mess. My dad smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "No, not yet." "Not yet, but I've got a plan. Just trust me, Lily. This isn't over." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to hold on to the hope that he had something up his sleeve, that he could fix this somehow. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of something much bigger than I could understand. I wanted to help, but what could I do? I wasn't in the meetings. I wasn't in the position to change things. All I could do was be there for him, offer moral support, try to ease the burden in whatever way I could. But deep down, I felt a growing frustration. I wanted to fix things, to make it all right, but I was powerless to do so. It wasn't until later that I started piecing it together. My dad wasn't just sitting back, letting things fall apart. He had been prepared for this. From the moment Adrian tried to undermine him, he had known exactly what would happen. He had been planning for this moment, waiting for Adrian to make his move. And I was starting to realize this wasn't just about a business deal. This was personal. And somehow I knew my dad was about to turn the tables. But I couldn't help but wonder, was it too late? The pieces of the puzzle were slowly starting to fall into place, but there was so much I still didn't understand. All I knew was that this wasn't over, and whatever was coming next, it was going to change everything. The days after the deal started to fall apart were filled with an eerie silence. No one was talking about the fallout openly, but there was an undeniable shift in the atmosphere. Everyone in the office knew something was wrong, but no one could quite put their finger on it. It was around this time that I started to notice little things. My dad wasn't as tense as I thought he'd be. He wasn't scrambling to fix things, rushing around like he usually did when something big was at stake. Instead, he was calm, almost unnervingly so. And I couldn't understand why. One evening, after dinner, Dad went into his study, shutting the door behind him. I didn't think much of it at first, but something pulled me toward his office. As I passed by, I noticed him on the phone, speaking softly but with a confidence I hadn't seen before. He wasn't just talking to anyone. His tone was different, controlled. There was a level of ease in his voice that didn't match the chaos I thought we were living through. It was as though, while the world outside was falling apart, my dad was standing still in the eye of the storm, perfectly composed. I tried not to eavesdrop, but it was hard not to hear the snippets of conversation. Words like confirmation and arranged kept popping up, and they made me wonder just what was going on. That's when I realized I had underestimated my dad. The next morning, the pieces started falling into place. I overheard Adam again, talking to a colleague in the hallway, and I caught a part of the conversation that made everything click. "Did you hear? Blake's been in touch with some of the European clients personally," Adam said, his voice low but filled with awe. "He's been building relationships with them for months, making sure they don't go with Olivia. They're bypassing her now and calling him directly." It hit me like a ton of bricks. All this time, while Adrian had been busy undermining him, my dad had been working behind the scenes. He had reached out to the key clients before the deal even started, carefully cultivating a personal connection with them. It was all part of his plan. Not only had he built these relationships, but he had also secured a backup server that held every bit of data for the presentation, just in case something like this happened. Adrian had no idea. I felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't just that Dad had been playing the long game, it was how he had done it, quietly, methodically. Every move had been calculated, planned long before Adrian's sabotage even took root. As the days passed, I learned more. Slowly, through whispered conversations and half-heard phone calls, the full scope of Dad's strategy became clear to me. He hadn't been caught off guard. He hadn't just been going along with the flow while Adrian tried to ruin him. No, he had been preparing for this moment from the start. He had known exactly what would happen when Adrian tried to push him out. He knew that the clients would turn to Olivia, and he knew she wouldn't be able to handle it. He knew that Adrian's arrogance would eventually crumble under the pressure, and when it did, my dad would be right there, waiting to step back in and take control. I started to see a different side of him, the side that had always been there, but that I had never fully understood before. The way he moved in silence. The way he stayed calm, even when everything seemed to be falling apart. It wasn't that he wasn't affected by it all. Of course he was. But he had a way of keeping his emotions in check, of staying focused on the bigger picture, no matter how messy things got in the short term. I had always thought of my dad as a guy who could fix things with a quick decision or a sharp word. But now, I realized that his true strength lay in his patience, his ability to plan, his ability to wait for the perfect moment to make his move. That was when I started to understand. My dad wasn't just reacting to the chaos. He was orchestrating it. He had been moving the pieces around all along, setting the stage for the ultimate comeback. I still didn't know how it would all unfold, but I knew one thing for sure. My dad wasn't done. He wasn't going to let Adrian or anyone else take away everything he had worked for, and I had a feeling that the storm was just getting started. It was a lot to process, but as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, I felt a new sense of respect for my dad. His calm, his silence, his ability to make moves behind the scenes. It all made sense now. And for the first time, I realized that the real battle hadn't even begun yet. My dad was ready. I just had to wait and see what happened next. The phone call came in the middle of the morning, just as I was sitting down with a cup of coffee. It was Adam calling my dad's office. I could hear my dad's calm voice on the other end, but I couldn't catch the words. I had learned by now to pay attention when things like this happened, but this time, something was different. There was an edge to the conversation, a shift that I couldn't quite place. Dad's voice, usually so steady, seemed to hold a hint of something else. There was a moment of silence, and then I heard him say, "I'll be right there." I stood up, feeling my heart race. Was this the moment everything changed? I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but deep down, I had a feeling that my dad was about to make his move. The way he had been preparing, how quietly he had handled everything up until now, it all pointed to this. He didn't speak much on the drive to the office. We sat in the car in silence, but I noticed the focus in his eyes, the way he set his jaw. It was as if everything in him was tuned to one singular purpose. When we walked into the building, I could feel the weight of what was happening. I wasn't sure exactly what was going to unfold, but there was an undeniable tension in the air. The clients had asked for my dad. They needed him. And Adrian? He had no choice but to give in. The meeting room was different this time. It was quiet, expectant. The clients were already seated at the table, their expressions serious, yet there was a flicker of hope in their eyes when they saw my dad walk in. They knew the man they had trusted with the deal was back. Adrian was standing by the window, arms crossed, but his eyes betrayed the uncertainty he was trying to hide. It was clear that he hadn't expected my dad to come back, let alone take control of the room so effortlessly. But there was no denying it. Aaron Blake was in charge. Again. Dad walked up to the front, his presence commanding attention without a single word. He set his laptop down, glancing briefly at Olivia, who was now sitting quietly at the back of the room, her earlier confidence gone. The tension between them was palpable, but my dad didn't flinch. I watched as he began to speak. Calm, collected. But when he started, it was like everything else faded into the background. He didn't just present the deal. He dismantled Olivia's mistakes. Each misstep she had made was carefully addressed, not with harsh words, but with the expertise that only my dad could provide. His knowledge of the clients, his understanding of every nuance in the deal, restored their confidence in an instant. It wasn't just about fixing Olivia's errors, it was about showcasing what made my dad invaluable. The relationships he had built, the trust he had earned, and the experience that no one could replace. I could see the clients leaning in, nodding, and exchanging looks of approval. It was happening. The deal was turning around. By the time Dad finished presenting, there was no doubt left. The deal was back on track, and my dad had single-handedly restored the client's faith in Lumitech. It was nothing short of a triumph, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride swelling in my chest. As the meeting ended, the clients stood and publicly praised my dad. Aaron Blake, the only man for the job, one of them said with a smile. It was everything he had worked for, everything Adrian had tried to take from him, all restored in a single moment. But the real twist came next. Word started to spread quickly through the office. The CEO of Lumitech, having witnessed the success of the deal under my dad's leadership, called for an internal investigation into Adrian's actions. The truth about Adrian's sabotage, how he had undermined my dad and tried to sabotage the company, was coming to light. The investigation revealed how Adrian's arrogance and mismanagement had harmed the company's reputation. His attempt to push my dad out of the picture had been a disastrous move, and now it was costing him everything. I didn't expect what came next. Adrian was fired in the most public and humiliating way. The CEO made sure the whole company knew about it. It was like watching a slow-motion crash, the downfall of a man who had thought he could outsmart my dad. The vindication I saw in my dad's eyes when the news spread was all I needed to see. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Adrian's smug confidence had evaporated. He was a shell of the man who had thought he could take down Aaron Blake. And as I stood there, watching the aftermath unfold, I realized something. This wasn't just about business. This wasn't just about a deal. My dad had proven something far more important. It wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It wasn't about playing the game at someone else's pace. It was about staying calm, trusting your own abilities, and knowing when to make your move. My dad had turned the tables, and now everyone would know his name, not just as a worker, but as someone who couldn't be underestimated. I had watched my dad through all of this, and in that moment, I understood him in a way I never had before. It wasn't just the win that mattered. It was the journey, the way he had stayed quiet, stayed focused, and never gave up. He didn't just fight for his career. He fought for his dignity. And in the end, that was what made all the difference. The weeks following the deal's success were a whirlwind. Every time I walked into the office, there was a new level of respect in the air, both for my dad and for Lumitech as a whole. The once tense, uncertain environment had transformed. People weren't just talking about the deal, they were talking about my dad, his comeback, and how he had saved the company from the brink of disaster. But the biggest change came when the CEO finally called my dad into his office. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew that something important was about to happen. The next day, Dad came home later than usual. He walked in, his steps steady, but I could tell something was different about him. He didn't have his usual calm demeanor. There was a spark in his eyes, a quiet excitement. I had never seen him like this before. "Lily, sit down for a minute," he said as he hung up his jacket. "We need to talk." I didn't know what was going on, but my heart started racing. Was this about the deal? Or something else? He sat across from me, his gaze intense but kind. "The CEO offered me a promotion," he said, his voice calm but with an edge of pride. "He wants me to take over as head of global partnerships." I blinked in surprise. This was huge. The CEO had recognized my dad's value, his loyalty, and the expertise that had kept the company afloat during its darkest moments. It was a dream opportunity, one that many would kill for. But as I looked at my dad, I noticed something. He wasn't jumping at the chance. "Why didn't you take it?" I asked, my curiosity getting the better of me. He smiled softly. "It's not the right time yet. The job is tempting, but there's something I need to do first." And that's when it hit me. My dad wasn't just thinking about his own career. He was thinking about the company, about making sure that no one like Adrian could ever wield power again. He wanted to restructure things, to make sure the leadership was solid, built on trust and integrity, not on manipulation and sabotage. Over the next few weeks, my dad worked closely with the CEO and other executives to create a plan for restructuring Lumitech's leadership. It wasn't just about the big deals or the flashy titles. It was about creating a system where the right people, with the right values, would rise to the top. People who wouldn't tear others down to get ahead. The changes he put in motion were big, and they affected everyone, from the board members to the newest hires. Adrian's influence was completely erased, and the company began to feel more cohesive, more united. The power dynamics had shifted, and it was clear to everyone that my dad wasn't just a survivor. He was a leader in every sense of the word. As I watched all of this unfold, I realized how much I had learned from him. His quiet strength, his ability to stay calm in the face of crisis, how he fought for what was right, not just for himself, but for everyone around him. That evening, I sat with my dad at the kitchen table, the weight of everything that had happened settling in. He was still the same calm, thoughtful man I had always known, but now there was a new layer of respect for him. Not just as my father, but as a man who had fought for his principles and, in doing so, had shaped the future for everyone at Lumitech. "I'm proud of you, Dad," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. He looked up at me, his eyes softening. "You should be, Lily. But more than that, I hope you understand the most important lesson I've learned." "What's that?" I asked. "Integrity," he said simply. "It's not about the money, the titles, or the recognition. It's about doing the right thing, even when no one is watching. And when you do that, everything else will fall into place. I nodded, taking in his words. I had always admired my dad, but now I understood him on a deeper level. His success wasn't just about skill or experience. It was about how he treated people, how he built those relationships over time, and how he never let his values slip, even when the world around him tried to knock him down. As time passed, things at Lumitech began to settle into a new rhythm. My dad's influence was felt across the company, and I knew that the changes he had made would have a lasting impact. The company was stronger than ever, and so was my dad. One afternoon, a few months later, I found myself sitting with a group of friends at a cafe, sharing stories and catching up. The conversation turned to work, and somehow I found myself telling them about my dad, about how he had faced the biggest challenge of his career, how he had been publicly humiliated, and how he had turned it all around with nothing but quiet strength, integrity, and a little patience. I could see the awe in their eyes as I spoke. And as I finished the story, I realized something. This wasn't just my dad's story anymore. It was mine too. And one day, I hope to follow in his footsteps, facing challenges with dignity, staying true to myself, and building relationships that mattered. Maybe I'll take a page out of his book, I said, smiling to myself. I want to be like him one day. And I knew I would be, because now, more than ever, I understood what it really meant to succeed, not just in business, but in life. The story of my dad's comeback, his strength, and his unshakable values had taught me more than I could have ever imagined. It had taught me that the true measure of success wasn't how fast you climbed to the top, but how you treated people on the way up, and how you held onto your principles when everything else was falling apart. And that's the kind of person I wanted to be. The end of his story wasn't just about the promotion or the triumph over Adrian. It was about the lessons he taught me, and the legacy he left behind for me to carry forward. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on all our latest content. Your support means the world to us. If you want to help us create even more amazing stories, consider showing your appreciation by hitting the super thanks button below. Every little bit helps us keep the channel going strong. Also, don't forget to check out the join button for exclusive perks and behind-the-scenes content. We'd love for you to be part of our community. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more inspiring stories.